The late summer sun hung low over Brenton, a small town in the heart of America where the air carried the weight of unspoken histories. Its courthouse, a squat, white stone building with columns that seemed to lean under the burden of decades, stood at the center of Main Street, its steps worn smooth by the feet of those seeking justice or fleeing it. On this August afternoon, the breeze was sluggish, stirring the leaves of ancient oaks that lined the plaza, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the pavement. The town was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt like a hell breath, the kind that came before a storm nobody saw brewing. Eleanor Thompson, 67, sat on the courthouse steps, her posture as unyielding as the stone beneath her. Her silver hair, braided neatly and pinned at the nape of her neck, caught the sunlight, glinting like a quiet rebellion against the heat. She wore a deep blue dress, its hem brushing her ankles, and her hands rested gently on a faded photograph, creased at the corners from years of careful handling. The black and white image showed a younger man, her late husband, Reverend Isaiah Thompson, his pastor's collar stark against his dark skin, his wrists bound by steel cuffs in 1965. Behind him, a blurred line of marchers held signs that would later be framed in history books, "Equal Justice Now." Eleanor's eyes, deep and steady, traced the photo, not with nostalgia but with purpose, as if she were drawing strength from the ink itself. The townsfolk passing by stole glances at her, some curious, others uneasy. Eleanor was no stranger to Brenton. The sound of boots broke the rhythm of the afternoon, sharp and heavy, unhurried but deliberate. Sheriff Tom Carver, 48, emerged from the courthouse doors, his khaki uniform crisp despite the humidity, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the world back at itself. His jaw was tight, his lips curled into a smirk that had long ago become his default express-iona mask of authority that hid whatever doubts he might once have had. Carver was Brenton's law, or so he believed. For 20 years he'd worn the badge like a crown, his word carrying more weight than any court ruling in this corner of the county. He'd broken up bar fights, chased down petty thieves, and stared down protesters with the same cold certainty that he was the line between order and chaos. Carver stopped a few steps above Eleanor, his shadow falling across her lap like a stain. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, hands on his hips, letting his presence do the work of intimidation. The plaza seemed to shrink around him, the air growing thicker as the few onlookers froze, sensing a confrontation they hadn't anticipated. Eleanor didn't look up. Her fingers traced the edge of the photograph, her breathing steady, as if the man casting the shadow was no more significant than the breeze. "Waiting on a ticket back to the 60s, ma'am?" Carver's voice cut through the silence, thin and mean, polished by years of practice. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The smirk on Carver's face flickered, a crack in his armor. He wasn't used to being ignored, not in Brenton, not by anyone, least of all a woman whose age and race, in his mind, should have made her invisible. He stepped closer, his boots now fully in her space, the leather brushing the hem of her dress. "You know what happens to folks who think the law is some kind of poem they can recite," he said, his voice slower now, savoring the threat. "They get run over by the ones who know it's just a hammer. And I swing it." Eleanor lifted her gaze, slow and deliberate, like clouds parting to reveal a storm. Her eyes met his, not with defiance or fear, but with something older, deeper a weight that made Carver's smirk falter again. "I'm waiting for a courtroom with justice inside it," she said, her voice steady, each word carrying the resonance of a bell rung from a sacred place. It wasn't a challenge or a plea, it was a truth plain and unyielding, and it hung in the air like a verdict. Carver's jaw twitched. He pulled a small black radio from his belt, thumbing the button with a flick that betrayed his impatience. "Got a loiterer on the courthouse steps," he said into the receiver, his voice flat but laced with venom. "Older woman obstructing public order. Possible agitator." He spoke the words loudly, wanting them to sting, wanting Eleanor to feel the weight of being labeled a threat. She blinked once, slowly, her hand still on the photograph, her silence louder than his radio's crackle. The crowd grew, drawn by the spectacle. A man in a suit paused, briefcase in hand, his face torn between curiosity and discomfort. A young woman with earbuds pulled them out, her phone now recording, the red dot of her camera a silent witness. Whispers spread, a low hum of unease. "What's she done?" someone muttered. "Nothing," another replied. "She's just sitting there." The teenager with the skateboard edged closer, his phone angled to capture Carver's every move. Carver stepped closer still, his boots now inches from Eleanor's chair. "You think your husband's old marches mean anything anymore?" he said, his voice dropping to a hiss, meant for her ears alone. "He's dust, lady. That photo's just a ghost, and ghosts don't vote in my county." He leaned down, his breath sharp with coffee and contempt. You're making a mess and I clean messes. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the photograph, but her face remained serene, her eyes looking not at Carver but through him, as if he were a shadow she'd long since learned to step over. The wind shifted, cooler now, carrying the faint scent of rain from the west. The courthouse flag flapped once, a sharp sound like a whip cracking. Carver straightened, his shoulders rolling as if shaking off her silence, which he hated more than any shout. Silence to him was disobedience, and disobedience demanded correction. You like sitting here, huh? He said, louder now, playing to the growing crowd. Think you're some kind of martyr? News flash, nobody's building statues for you. He reached into his belt, pulling out a plastic water bottle, the kind you find in a gas station cooler, its label half-peeled. He twisted the cap slowly, the crinkle of plastic cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers. Let's cool off this little protest, he said, his smirk returning, sharper now, as if he'd found the perfect stage for his performance. Without warning, he tilted the bottle, and a thin stream of water fell, catching the light before it struck Eleanor's silver hair. It slid through her braids, soaking her scalp, trailing down her neck, and darkening the blue of her dress. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air from the plaza. The teenager's phone shook slightly, but he kept recording. The woman with the stroller froze, her hand over her mouth. Carver poured slowly, deliberately, each drop a calculated insult, his eyes fixed on Eleanor's face, searching for a flinch, a tear, anything to prove he'd won. Eleanor didn't move. Her eyes closed briefly, not in surrender but in resolve, as if she were gathering the strength of every march, every insult, every moment she'd endured in her 67 years. The water pooled at her feet, a small constellation of droplets on the stone steps. Shimmering like tears, the earth refused to cry. Time to wash away the past, Carver muttered, stepping back to admire his work, the bottle now limp in his hand. He tossed it aside, the plastic clattering against the pavement, a hollow sound that echoed in the stunned silence. The crowd stirred, voices rising now, a mix of shock and anger. What the hell, Carver? A man shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. She's not hurting anyone, a woman called, stepping forward, her phone raised. Carver turned, his smirk hardening into a scowl. This is my town, he snapped, his voice booming across the plaza. You don't like it, take it up with the law. He pointed at Eleanor, still seated, still silent, her wet hair glistening like a crown. She's trespassing. Inciting trouble. I'm doing my job. Eleanor opened her eyes, and the look she gave Carver wasn't anger or fear, it was pity, the kind that cuts deeper than any curse. Your job, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the steps, silencing the crowd. You're wearing a costume, not a calling. The words landed like a blade, precise and lethal, and for a moment, Carver froze, his hand hovering over his radio, his confidence cracking under the weight of her gaze. The tension broke when Carver grabbed a pair of oversized handcuffs from his belt, the steel glinting in the sun. He wrenched Eleanor's wrist from her lap, snapping the cuff around it with a loud click, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. The photograph fluttered to the ground, landing face up, Isaiah's solemn eyes staring up at the sky. Carver cuffed her other wrist, jerking her to her feet with more force than necessary. Eleanor stumbled once, her foot catching on the chair, but she caught herself standing tall, her wet dress clinging to her but her dignity untouched. You're under arrest, Carver growled, his voice loud enough for the cameras. Trespassing, incitement, obstruction of public order. He shoved her toward his cruiser, parked at the curb, its red and blue lights flashing lazily, as if mocking the urgency of the moment. The crowd surged forward, phones raised, voices overlapping in a cacophony of protest. Let her go, a young man shouted, pushing through the onlookers. This ain't right, a woman cried, tears in her eyes. Eleanor walked with grace, her steps measured, her head high. She adjusted the hem of her dress before sliding into the cruiser's back seat, careful not to let the fabric catch on the door. Carver slammed the door, the sound echoing across the plaza, a punctuation mark on his authority. He climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel as if to anchor himself against the rising tide of anger outside. The cruiser roared to life, and as it pulled away, the crowd parted reluctantly, their phones still recording, their voices chasing the car down Main Street. Inside the cruiser, the air was stifling, the vinyl seats radiating heat. Carver tilted his head slightly, glancing at Eleanor in the rearview mirror. You think this little stunt changes anything? He said, his voice a mix of scorn and unease. You're just another old lady stirring up trouble, thinking the world owes you something. Eleanor met his gaze in the mirror, her eyes calm but unyielding. "The world owes me nothing," she said. "But it owes you a mirror." Carver's knuckles whitened on the wheel, and the cruiser swerved slightly as he took a corner too fast, the tires screeching against the asphalt. He didn't respond, but the silence between them was heavy, filled with the sound of his own doubts, amplified by her composure. Outside, Brenton rolled by its faded storefronts, its sunburned lawns, its people standing on sidewalks, watching the cruiser pass with expressions of shock, anger, and something else, recognition. They knew Eleanor. They knew Carver. And they knew in that moment that something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. As the cruiser approached the sheriff's station, a small group of protesters had already gathered, alerted by the videos now spreading online. They held signs hastily scrawled with markers, "Justice for Eleanor, no more Carver." A young woman, her face streaked with tears, pounded on the cruiser's hood as it slowed, her voice breaking. He yanked open the back door, pulling Eleanor out with a roughness that drew gasps from the onlookers. Her foot caught on the curb, and for a split second she teetered, but she steadied herself, standing tall, her wet hair and dress a testament to her endurance. Carver marched her toward the station's back entrance, past a deputy who looked away, his face flushed with shame. The door buzzed open, and as Eleanor stepped inside, she glanced back at the crowd, her eyes meeting the teenager with the skateboard, who was still recording, his hands shaking but his resolve firm. The door slammed shut, but the echo of that moment lingered in the plaza, in the phones, in the hearts of those who'd witnessed it. Eleanor Thompson, soaked but unbroken, had just ignited a spark that would burn through Brenton and beyond. And Tom Carver, in his arrogance, had no idea he just signed his own sentence. The Brenton Sheriff Station was a low, concrete building that squatted at the edge of town, its gray walls stained by years of rain and neglect. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant, the kind of place where hope came to curdle. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor on the linoleum floors, scuffed by boots and the weight of countless stories that never made the news. It was here, in a windowless interrogation room, that Eleanor Thompson sat, her wrists still cuffed, her blue dress damp and clinging to her frame. The water from Sheriff Tom Carver's cruel stunt had dried into faint streaks on her silver braids, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire, unyielding as ever. Across town, in a nondescript office above a shuttered hardware store, Marcus Thompson, 42, sat hunched over a bank of monitors, his fingers flying across a keyboard. To the world he was James Carter, a soft-spoken IT technician who fixed printers and grumbled about slow Wi-Fi. But the badge clipped to his belt, a fake, meticulously crafted, hid his true identity. A covert operative for the Department of Justice, embedded in Brenton for months to investigate systemic corruption in the sheriff's department. His face, shadowed by the glow of the screens, was a mask of focus, his jaw tight as he watched the live feed from a hidden camera in the interrogation room. Eleanor, his mother, stared back at him through the grainy footage, her composure a silent command. "Do what you came here to do." Marcus's office was a fortress of technology, its walls lined with servers humming softly, their lights blinking like a constellation of secrets. A single window, covered by blackout curtains, kept the world at bay. On his desk sat a burner phone, an encrypted comms device, and a photograph of him and Eleanor at a church picnic years ago, her smile warm but fierce, his own guarded even then. He'd chosen this life solitary, shadowed because he believed in justice, not as an ideal but as a weapon, one he'd learned to wield from the woman now cuffed in Carver's station. The feed showed Carver pacing the interrogation room, his boots thudding against the floor, his mirrored sunglasses pushed up into his thinning hair. He leaned over the metal table, his hands splayed, his face inches from Eleanor's. "You think you're some kind of hero, sitting out there like you own the damn courthouse?" he snarled, his voice low but jagged, the kind of tone that had broken lesser spirits. "This town doesn't need your kind stirring up old wounds. We've moved on." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying a puzzle she'd already solved. "Moved on," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "You're standing on the same ground my husband bled on, wearing the same hate he faced. The only thing moving here is your mouth." Her words landed like a whip, sharp and precise, and Carver flinched, a micro-expression Marcus caught on the zoomed-in feed. The sheriff straightened, his fingers twitching toward the baton at his belt, but he didn't draw it, not yet. Marcus's hands paused over the keyboard, his breath steady but his pulse quickening. He'd spent months building a case against Carver. wiretaps catching whispered deals with local developers, body cam footage lost after questionable arrests, complaints from Black and Latino residents buried in bureaucratic limbo. But this moment, this act of cruelty against his own mother, was the spark he needed to ignite the DOJ's full attention. He tapped a key, and the footage from the courthouse plaza Carver pouring water over Eleanor's head uploaded to a secure server in D.C., time-stamped and encrypted. Another tap sent a coded message to his handler. Brenton protocol initiated. Target Carver. Evidence secured. Back in the interrogation room, Carver's composure was fraying. He grabbed a second water bottle from a mini fridge in the corner, its plastic crinkling as he twisted the cap. "You like making speeches, huh?" he said, his voice louder now, meant to fill the room with his authority. "Let's see how you talk when you're really cooled off." He tilted the bottle and water splashed across Eleanor's face, running in rivulets down her cheeks. She closed her eyes briefly, her lips parting as if to sigh, but her posture remained regal, her hands folded in her lap despite the cuffs. The water dripped onto the table, pooling around the base of the photograph of her late husband, which Carver had tossed there like trash. Marcus's fingers froze, his eyes locked on the screen. His training screamed at him to stay detached, to see Eleanor as a civilian asset, not his mother. But the sight of her soaked, cuffed, yet unbroken cracked something deep inside him. He leaned into the comms device, his voice low and urgent. "Agent Ruiz, I need boots on the ground in 30 minutes. Carver's escalating. I'm rerouting all station feeds to you now." A crackle came through, then a woman's voice, calm but clipped. "Copy that, Carter. ETA 25. Keep the feed live." In the station's hallway, a janitor named Reggie, a wiry man in his 50s with a limp from an old factory injury, paused his mop. Through the cracked door of the interrogation room, he saw Carver's second act of cruelty, the water bottle glinting under the fluorescent light. Reggie's face tightened, his hands gripping the mop handle until his knuckles blanched. He'd known Eleanor for years, brought him soup when his wife was sick, prayed with him at church after his son's arrest. He slipped into a supply closet, pulling out a burner phone he kept for emergencies, and dialed a number he'd memorized but never used. A local reporter named Clara Vance, known for her dogged coverage of Brenton's underbelly. "Clara," he whispered, his voice shaking, "you need to get to the station. Sheriff's got Mrs. Thompson in there, and it's bad." Clara, sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks away, scribbled notes on a napkin, her phone pressed to her ear. "Reggie, slow down. What's he doing?" she asked, already grabbing her recorder. Reggie's voice broke as he recounted the water, the cuffs, Eleanor's silence. Clara's eyes narrowed. She'd been chasing rumors about Carver for years, kickbacks, intimidation, racial profiling, but proof was slippery. This, though, was different. She hung up, slung her bag over her shoulder, and sprinted toward her car, her mind racing with headlines. Inside the interrogation room, Carver's taunts grew bolder, fueled by Eleanor's refusal to break. He slammed the baton on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot, making the deputy outside the door jump. "You think you're untouchable because of some old civil rights ghost?" he hissed, leaning so close his breath stirred the wet strands of her hair. "Your husband's marches didn't change nothing. This is my town, and I decide who gets to play martyr." He tapped the baton rhythmically, a predator toying with prey, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Eleanor's silence was a mirror, reflecting his own fragility back at him. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her cuffs clinking against the table. "You're not the first man to think a badge makes him God," she said, her voice low but resonant, filling the room like a hymn. "And you won't be the last to learn it doesn't. You're scared, Tom Carver, because you know this room can't hold me." Her use of his name, stripped of his title, hit like a slap. Carver's face reddened, his baton pausing mid-tap. For a moment he looked like a man unmoored, caught between rage and doubt. Marcus, watching, felt a surge of pride but also fear. His mother's defiance was a beacon, but it was also a risk. Carver was unraveling, and desperate men were unpredictable. He switched to a second monitor, pulling up the station's internal cameras. The deputy in the hallway, a young man named Kyle, shifted nervously, his hand hovering over his radio. Marcus zoomed in, catching the conflict in Kyle's eyes, loyalty to Carver warring with disgust at what he'd glimpsed through the door. Marcus made a mental note. Kyle could be a weak link, a potential ally if pressed. In the interrogation room, Carver recovered, his smirk returning, though it was shakier now. He grabbed the photograph of Isaiah Thompson, holding it up like a trophy. "This guy," he said, waving it in front of Eleanor, "he thought he could change the world too. Look where it got him 6 feet under, and you're still fighting his fights. Pathetic." He tore the photo in half, the sound ripping through the room, and let the pieces flutter to the wet floor. Eleanor's breath caught, the first crack in her composure, but it was fleeting. She closed her eyes, her lips moving silently, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in memory. When she opened them, her gaze was molten, a force that made Carver step back instinctively. "You can tear paper," she said, her voice trembling not with fear but with conviction. "But you can't tear truth. And truth is coming for you." Marcus's hand shook as he watched the torn photo hit the floor. He forced himself to breathe, channeling his anger into action. He hacked into the station's intercom system, looping a faint static hum to mask the sound of his next move. Rerouting the interrogation room's audio to a secure DOJ archive. Every word Carver spoke was now evidence, every taunt a nail in his coffin. Marcus leaned into the comms again. "Ruiz, I've got audio and video locked. Carver's giving us a gold mine. Push the ETA if you can." Ruiz's voice crackled back. "FBI's rolling in from the regional office. 20 minutes. Hold the fort, Carter." Marcus nodded, though she couldn't see him, and switched to a third monitor, this one showing the courthouse plaza. The crowd had grown, spilling onto Main Street, their signs bobbing above their heads. "Free Eleanor, Carver must go." The teenager with the skateboard was still there, live streaming to a growing audience, his voice raw as he narrated the scene. Marcus's burner phone buzzed with an alert. The courthouse footage had hit 10,000 views on a local activist's page, shared with hashtags that were starting to trend. Back in the station, Carver's frustration boiled over. He grabbed a chair, dragging it across the floor with a screech, and sat opposite Eleanor, his face inches from hers. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said, his voice a growl. "You think you can sit there quiet as a mouse and make me look like the bad guy? I'm the law here. I decide what's right." He slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating through the room, but Eleanor didn't blink. "You decide nothing," she said, her voice cutting through his bluster like a blade. "You're a man playing king in a house of cards, and the wind's already blowing." Her words hung in the air, a prophecy wrapped in calm, and Carver's fist unclenched, his hand trembling slightly. He stood abruptly, knocking the chair over, and stormed to the door, barking at the deputy outside. "Kyle, get in here. Watch her. I need air." Kyle entered, his face pale, his eyes avoiding Eleanor's. He stood by the wall, his hands clasped behind his back, the picture of a man who wanted to be anywhere else. Eleanor looked at him, her gaze softening but still piercing. "You don't have to stand with him, son," she said quietly. "You know what's right." Kyle's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the floor where the torn photo lay. Outside, Clara Vance arrived at the station, her car skidding to a stop in the parking lot. She jumped out, recorder in hand, and pushed through the growing crowd, now chanting Eleanor's name. She spotted Reggie near the entrance, his mop abandoned, his face etched with fear and resolve. "Clara," he whispered, pulling her aside. "He's in there with her now. It's worse than I said." He tore up her husband's picture. Clara's eyes widened, her recorder already running. "Stay safe, Reggie," she said, squeezing his arm before slipping toward the station's front desk, her press badge ready. Marcus, monitoring the external cameras, saw Clara's arrival and cursed under his breath. A reporter was a wild card, but she could amplify the pressure on Carver. He sent an anonymous tip to her burner email, a single line: "Check the station's back entrance. Feds incoming." Clara's phone pinged as she argued with the desk sergeant, and her eyes flicked to the screen, her pulse quickening. She stepped back, pretending to leave, but circled toward the back, her recorder still running. Inside the interrogation room, Eleanor sat alone, Kyle's presence a ghost in the corner. She closed her eyes, her lips moving again, her cuffed hands resting on the table. The room was silent except for the buzz of the fluorescent light, flickering like a warning. But outside, the world was roaring to life. Marcus's servers hummed. Clara's recorder captured every shout. The crowd's chants grew louder, and somewhere, a fleet of black SUVs sped toward Brenton, their sirens silent but their purpose clear. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the monitors, his mind racing. He'd planned for every contingency, but this moment, with his mother at the center, was a test he hadn't anticipated. He touched the photograph on his desk, Eleanor's smile grounding him, and whispered, "Hold on, Mama. We're almost there." The screens flickered, the feed steady, and the clock ticked down. Carver's reckoning was coming, and Marcus was its architect. The Brenton Sheriff Station pulsed with a raw, electric energy, as if the building itself sensed the storm about to break. Outside, the crowd had swelled to over 100, spilling from the parking lot onto the cracked asphalt of Main Street. Their voices rose in a ragged chorus, chanting "Free Eleanor. Justice now." Handmade signs bobbed above their heads, scrawled with marker and fury. "Carver must go, no more hate." The August sun beat down, glinting off phone screens as people recorded, live-streamed, and tweeted, their anger amplified by the 47-second video now burning through the internet. A grainy clip of Sheriff Tom Carver pouring water over Eleanor Thompson's silver braids, his smirk a badge of cruelty. Inside the interrogation room, Eleanor sat alone, her wrists still cuffed, her blue dress damp but her posture unbroken. The fluorescent light flickered, casting jagged shadows across the torn photograph of her late husband, Isaiah, scattered on the wet floor. Deputy Kyle, stationed by the wall, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Eleanor and the door. Her words lingered in the air, "You know what's right," and they gnawed at him, a quiet accusation he couldn't shake. The station's intercom buzzed faintly, a looped static hum Marcus had engineered to mask his surveillance. But to Kyle, it felt like the building was holding its breath. Across town, Marcus Thompson, 42, sat in his covert command center, his monitors glowing with feeds from the station, the courthouse plaza, and now the sheriff's parking lot. His fingers danced across the keyboard, finalizing the upload of Carver's interrogation audio to DOJ servers. The evidence was ironclad. Carver's taunts, the water, the torn photo, all time-stamped and backed up in triplicate. Marcus leaned into his comms, his voice steady but urgent. "Ruiz, what's the ETA?" Crowd's getting restless and Carver's losing it. Agent Ruiz's voice crackled back. "FBI's 10 minutes out. Hold the line, Carter. We're bringing the cavalry." Outside the station, Clara Vance, the reporter, crouched behind a dumpster at the back in trance, her recorder running. Her burner email had pinged with Marcus's anonymous tip feds incoming, and her instincts screamed that this was the story of her career. She peeked around the corner, catching sight of Reggie, the janitor, lingering near the employee exit, his face etched with fear but his posture resolute. Clara waved him over, whispering, "Reggie, what's happening inside?" He shook his head, his voice low. "Carver's gone mad. He's yelling at everyone, saying he's untouchable. But Mrs. Thompson's like a rock. Ain't budging." Inside, Carver stormed back into the interrogation room, his face flushed, his mirrored sunglasses back on to hide the panic creeping into his eyes. He'd stepped outside for air, but the crowd's chants had followed him, their voices seeping through the station's walls like an accusation he couldn't silence. He slammed the door, the sound making Kyle jump. "You," Carver barked, pointing at Eleanor, "think you've got this town wrapped around your finger, don't you? Think you can sit there, quiet as a saint, and make me the villain?" He paced, his boots thudding, his baton tapping against his thigh like a metronome of rage. Eleanor looked up, her eyes calm but piercing, cutting through his bluster. "I don't make villains, Tom," she said, her voice soft but resonant, filling the room like a prayer. "You did that yourself when you picked up that bottle." Her words hit like a blade and Carver froze, his baton mid-tap. For a moment he looked lost, a man staring into a mirror he'd avoided for years. Then his face hardened, and he leaned over the table, his breath hot and uneven. "You're nothing," he hissed. "Just an old woman clinging to a dead man's dreams. This town's mine, and I'll bury you like I buried him." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "You didn't bury Isaiah," she said, her voice steady, each word a stone laid in a foundation of truth. "His dreams are in every step I take, every breath this town breathes. You're the one digging your own grave." Her words echoed in the small room and Kyle, still by the wall, swallowed hard, his hands clenching behind his back. Carver's face twisted, rage warring with something deeper, fear, perhaps, or the dawning realization that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Marcus, watching the feed, clenched his jaw. His mother's defiance was a beacon, but it was also a spark in a powder keg. He switched to the external camera, zooming in on the crowd. The teenager with the skateboard, now joined by friends, held his phone high, his live stream hitting 50,000 viewers. A woman in a nurse's uniform shouted into a megaphone, her voice raw, "We're not leaving until Eleanor's free." The crowd roared, their signs waving like battle flags. Marcus's burner phone buzzed with alerts. The video had hit national news feeds, shared by activists, celebrities, and even a senator from Georgia. Justice for Eleanor was trending, a digital tidal wave building momentum. Back in the station, Carver's radio crackled, the desk sergeant's voice urgent. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. Crowds blocking the street, and news vans are pulling up. CNN's here." Carver's eyes widened, his sunglasses slipping slightly. He grabbed the radio, his voice sharp. "Keep them out. Barricade the lot if you have to." He turned to Kyle, snapping, "Get out there and help. I'll handle her." Kyle hesitated, his eyes flicking to Eleanor, who gave him a slight nod, as if releasing him from her judgment. He slipped out, his shoulders hunched, leaving Carver and Eleanor alone. Carver rounded the table, his baton now in hand, its weight a threat he didn't need to voice. "You think this little circus outside saves you?" he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "I've got friends in high places. Judges, councilmen, people who know how to make problems like you disappear." He leaned in, his face inches from hers, the baton tapping her cuffed wrists lightly, a warning wrapped in menace. "Last chance, lady. Apologize, walk away, and I'll let you go home." Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of triumph but of certainty. "You don't let me do anything," she said, her voice a quiet thunder. "I'm already free. You're the one in chains." Her words struck like a bell, and Carver recoiled, his baton clattering to the floor. He scrambled to pick it up, his hands shaking, his authority unraveling with every second he spent in her presence. Outside, the crowd's chants grew louder, punctuated by the screech of tires as 3 black SUVs roared into the parking lot, their tinted windows reflecting the flashing lights of news cameras. FBI agents spilled out, clad in tactical vests, their badges gleaming. Agent Ruiz, a compact woman with a no-nonsense glare, led the charge, her radio crackling with orders. Clara, still hidden, caught the moment on her recorder, her breath catching as she realized the scale of what was unfolding. Reggie, spotting the feds, slipped back inside, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. Marcus's monitors lit up with the new arrivals, and he exhaled, a weight lifting from his chest. He tapped a key, sending a final encrypted message to Ruiz. "Target in interrogation room 3. Evidence livestream to DOJ. Go now." He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the feet of his mother, her face serene despite the cuffs, the water, the torn photo. "You did it, Mama," he whispered, his voice thick with pride. Inside the station, the front desk sergeant shouted into his radio, his voice panicked. "Sheriff, feds are here. They've got warrants." Carver froze, his baton still in hand, his eyes darting to the door. The intercom static cut out, replaced by a sharp buzz as the station's security system registered an override Marcus's doing, unlocking doors for the feds. Heavy boots pounded down the hallway, a rhythm of inevitability, and Carver's face drained of color, his sunglasses falling to the table. The door burst open and Ruiz stormed in, flanked by 2 agents, their hands on their holsters. "Thomas Carver," she barked, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You're under arrest for abuse of power, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice." She held up a warrant, its pages crisp and damning, as an agent moved to cuff Carver. He backed away, his hands raised, his voice cracking. "This is a mistake. You can't do this. I'm the sheriff." Ruiz's eyes narrowed. "Not anymore." The cuffs clicked around Carver's wrists, the sound echoing like a gavel. Eleanor stood slowly, her movements deliberate, her wet dress clinging to her but her dignity a shield. Carver's eyes met hers and for the first time, he looked small, a man stripped of his illusions, his power leaking away like the water on the floor. Kyle, re-entering the room, froze at the sight, his face pale. "Sheriff?" he stammered, but Carver didn't respond. His gaze locked on Eleanor, searching for something, mercy perhaps, or absolution that she had no reason to give. Ruiz nodded to an agent who uncuffed Eleanor, the steel falling away with a soft clank. She rubbed her wrists, her eyes never leaving Carver, her silence louder than any verdict. Marcus, watching, stood and removed his fake badge, clipping it to his belt as a reminder of the role he'd played. He stepped out of his office, locking the door behind him, and headed toward. As Carver was led out, the crowd erupted, their cheers a tidal wave of relief and rage. Phones captured every step, his head bowed, his cuffs glinting in the sun. A young woman threw a water bottle at him, its plastic bouncing off his shoulder, a symbolic echo of his own act. Carver flinched, his face crumpling, and the crowd roared louder, their voices a chorus of justice long delayed. Clara pushed through, shouting questions. "Sheriff, any comment on the video? Why did you target Mrs. Thompson?" But Carver said nothing, his silence a confession of its own. Eleanor emerged from the station, flanked by Ruiz, her steps steady despite the ordeal. The crowd hushed, then exploded into applause, their signs raised high. The teenager with the skateboard wept openly, his phone still recording, his live stream now at 100,000 viewers. Eleanor raised a hand, not in triumph but in acknowledgement, her eyes scanning the faces, young, old, black, white, angry, hopeful. She spotted Marcus in the crowd, his cap pulled low, and their eyes met, a silent exchange of love and resolve. Ruiz guided Eleanor to an SUV, but before she climbed in she turned to the crowd, her voice carrying across the lot. "This isn't my victory," she said, her words clear and strong. "It's ours. Keep standing, keep speaking, keep remembering." The crowd cheered, their voices shaking the air, and Eleanor slid into the vehicle, her blue dress a beacon against the black interior. Carver, loaded into a separate SUV, caught a final glimpse of her through the tinted window. His head sank, his shoulders slumping, the weight of his actions crushing him at last. As the feds pulled away, the crowd parted, their chants following the vehicles down Main Street, a requiem for Carver's reign and a hymn for Eleanor's resilience. Back at the station, Kyle stood alone in the interrogation room, staring at the torn photo on the floor. He bent down, gathering the pieces, his hands trembling. Outside, the crowd lingered, unwilling to let the moment fade. Clara's story was already filed, her headline searing. Brenton sheriff arrested after viral video of abuse. Marcus, slipping away, checked his phone. The DOJ had opened a full investigation into Brenton's sheriff's department, with Carver as the first domino to fall. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire. Brenton was no longer quiet, its streets alive with voices, its people awakened. Eleanor's silence had shattered a dynasty, and Carver's reckoning was only the beginning. The dust of Brenton's reckoning settled slowly, like ash after a wildfire, revealing a town transformed yet still scarred. The August heat gave way to September's softer light, but the air carried a new weight, a mix of hope, anger, and the unspoken question of what comes next when a wound is laid bare. The sheriff's station, once a fortress of Tom Carver's authority, now stood quiet, its parking lot empty save for a few news vans lingering like vultures. The courthouse steps, where Eleanor Thompson had sat unbowed, became a pilgrimage site, adorned with flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. "Thank you, Eleanor. We stand with you." Brenton was no longer just a dot on a map. It was a mirror, reflecting America's unfinished reckoning with its past. Tom Carver's fall was swift and merciless, a collapse so complete it seemed scripted for tragedy. Stripped of his badge within hours of his arrest, he was released on bail but found no refuge in the town he'd once ruled. His name was erased from county records, his office cleared out by deputies who avoided his gaze. The Brenton Gazette, which had once praised his tough-on-crime stance, ran a front-page story titled "Sheriff's Shame," with a still from the viral video. Carver's smirk frozen as water dripped from Eleanor's braids. The image became a cultural shorthand, shared in memes, plastered on protest signs, and debated on cable news from New York to Los Angeles. Carver's home, a modest ranch-style house on the edge of town, became a prison of his own making. The first night after his release, he sat in his living room, the curtains drawn, the TV muted but flashing with his own face. His wife Linda packed a suitcase in silence, her eyes red but resolute. "I can't stay, Tom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not with a man who doesn't see the wrong in what he did." She left that night, her car's taillights fading down the street, leaving Carver alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of his choices. The next morning, a teenager spray-painted watercop on his mailbox, the letters jagged and red, a nickname that stuck like a curse. He tried to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, venturing to Rusty's bar, a dive where he'd once been toasted as a hero. The room fell silent as he entered, the jukebox cutting off mid-song. His former deputies, nursing beers at a corner table, turned their backs, their silence louder than any insult. A bartender, a woman who'd known him for years, slid a glass of water across the counter, her face blank. "On the house," she said, and the room erupted in bitter laughter. Carver left without a word, the glass untouched, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. His attempts at redemption were futile. He showed up at a town hall meeting, hoping to defend himself, but the microphone cut out mid-sentence, a technical glitch Marcus had quietly arranged. The crowd walked out, leaving Carver alone on the stage, his voice echoing in the empty auditorium. A leaked email, exposed by Clara Vance, revealed he'd offered a $10,000 bribe to a local reporter to kill the story before it went viral. The revelation sealed his fate, turning even his few remaining allies against him. By October, Carver was a ghost in Brenton, his name a cautionary tale whispered in barbershops and church pews. Eleanor Thompson, by contrast, became a beacon, her image a symbol of resilience etched into the nation's consciousness. The video of her defiance sitting still as water dripped, her eyes unyielding, played on loop across networks, sparking protests from Atlanta to Seattle. In Chicago, a mural appeared on a community center, depicting Eleanor with silver braids and a gaze that seemed to see through time, caption still standing. In Harlem, a poet read a piece titled "The Steps," her words weaving Eleanor's silence into a tapestry of resistance, broadcast live to thousands. A high school in Brenton was renamed Eleanor Thompson Academy, its dedication ceremony drawing national attention, with students reciting her words. "Dignity doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand." Eleanor herself remained humble, shying from the spotlight but embracing her role as a voice for change. She spoke at a local school assembly, her blue dress replaced by a simple gray sweater, her voice soft but commanding. "This isn't about me," she told the students, their faces rapt, some holding signs they'd made in art class. "It's about what we build together, justice, not for one but for all." A girl in the front row, her braids echoing Eleanor's, raised her hand and asked, "How do you stay strong when people hurt you?" Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening. "You carry the love of those who came before you," she said. "That's heavier than any hate." The room erupted in applause, and Marcus, standing quietly at the back, felt his chest tighten with pride. Marcus's work didn't end with Carver's arrest. The DOJ investigation he'd sparked expanded, uncovering a web of corruption in Brenton's Sheriff's Department, kickbacks from developers, falsified reports, and a pattern of racial profiling stretching back decades. 3 deputies resigned, and 2 others faced charges. Marcus, still under his alias James Carter, worked late nights sifting through data, testifying in closed hearings, his identity a secret even to his mother. He visited Eleanor weekly, bringing her favorite peach cobbler, their conversations a mix of love and strategy. "You're just like your father," she told him once, her hand on his. "Quiet, but you move mountains." Marcus smiled, but the weight of his double life lingered in his eyes. The town itself began to heal, though the process was uneven. Brenton's city council, under pressure from protests, implemented reforms, mandatory body cam audits, diversity training, and term limits for sheriffs. A new interim sheriff, a black woman named Denise Harper, took office, her first act a public apology at the courthouse steps, where she laid a wreath for Eleanor. The gesture drew mixed reactions. Some cheered, others scoffed, calling it performative, but it marked a shift, a crack in the old order. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, now overflowed, with residents demanding accountability, their voices emboldened by Eleanor's example. Clara Vance's career soared, her reporting on Carver earning her a Pulitzer nomination. She published a series, Brenton's Breaking Point, weaving Eleanor's story with those of other residents who'd faced Carver's wrath. Reggie, the janitor, became a quiet hero, his testimony in Clara's articles revealing how he'd risked his job to expose Carver's actions. Clara offered him a small share of her book advance, but he refused, asking only for a new mop and a chance to keep working. "I did it for Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice steady. "She's family to this town." Kyle, the deputy who'd stood by during Eleanor's ordeal, grappled with his guilt. He resigned a week after Carver's arrest, unable to face the badge he'd worn with pride. He visited Eleanor at her home, a small bungalow with a garden bursting with roses, and stood on her porch, hat in hand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have stopped him." Eleanor studied him, her eyes kind but unflinching. "You're here now," she said. "What you do next matters more than what you didn't do then." Kyle nodded, tears in his eyes, and later joined a community group advocating for police reform. His story a small redemption in Brenton's larger reckoning. The nation's response to Eleanor's story was a kaleidoscope of awe and anger. A documentary, The Woman on the Steps, premiered at Sundance, its director embedding with Brenton's residents to capture their voices. A museum in Washington, D.C., displayed the torn photograph of Isaiah Thompson, pieced back together, alongside Eleanor's blue dress, now preserved as an artifact of resistance. Social media kept her story alive, with justice for Eleanor evolving into Stand Like Eleanor, a call to action for those facing injustice. A viral TikTok showed a young girl reciting Eleanor's words, her voice fierce, her eyes bright, the video garnering millions of views. Carver's life, meanwhile, continued to unravel. His trial, set for the following spring, loomed like a shadow, with prosecutors building a case that included not just Eleanor's assault but years of misconduct. He moved to a cheap apartment in a neighboring county, his savings drained by legal fees. One night, unable to sleep, he searched his name online, finding himself reduced to a #WaterCope, a caricature in political cartoons. He smashed his laptop, the screen shards reflecting his fractured face. A man who'd lost everything but his denial. Eleanor's influence reached beyond Brenton. She received letters from across the country, students, activists, mothers thanking her for her courage. One from a woman in Selma read, "You reminded me why we keep fighting. Your silence was louder than any march." Eleanor kept the letters in a box beside her Bible, reading them on quiet evenings, her fingers tracing the words as she'd once traced Isaiah's photograph. She spoke at a national conference on civil rights, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger, urging the audience to build bridges, not walls. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes, a tide of gratitude she accepted with a humble nod. Marcus, nearing the end of his assignment, began to question his path. The DOJ offered him a promotion, a desk job in D.C., but the idea of leaving Brenton, of stepping out of the shadows, felt like abandoning his mother's legacy. He walked the courthouse steps one evening, the plaza empty, the candles long burned out. He sat where Eleanor had sat, his hands on the stone, still warm from the day's sun. "What's next, Mama?" he whispered, the question hanging in the air. A breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of rain, and Marcus smiled, sensing her answer in the silence. Brenton's transformation wasn't complete, but it was real. A youth center opened, funded by donations inspired by Eleanor's story, its walls painted with murals of her and Isaiah. Local artists sold prints of Still Standing, the proceeds supporting legal aid for marginalized residents. The town's annual fair, once a celebration of its past, included a new exhibit on Brenton's civil rights history, with Eleanor as its centerpiece. Some resisted the changes, muttering about woke nonsense, but their voices were drowned out by a new generation, emboldened by the woman who'd sat on the steps. On a crisp October morning, Eleanor stood in her garden pruning roses, her hands steady despite the ache in her wrists from the cuffs. Marcus joined her, handing her a cup of tea, their silence comfortable, a language of their own. "They're naming a scholarship after you at the college," he said, his voice casual but proud. Eleanor chuckled, snipping a thorn stem. "Fancy that," she said. "All I did was sit." Marcus shook his head. "You did more than sit, Mama. You stood." As the sun rose, casting long shadows across Brenton, the town felt different, not healed but awake. Eleanor's silence had shattered a dynasty, and her strength had built a foundation for something new. Carver's name faded, a footnote in a story that wasn't his, while Eleanor's grew, a beacon for those who dared to stand. The steps remained, worn but enduring, waiting for the next story, the next voice, the next spark. Alright folks, let's take a breather from Brenton's drama and talk about why Eleanor Thompson's story hits us right in the feels, and maybe the funny bone too. Picture this. It's 2025 and we're all scrolling X, dodging hot takes and cat videos, when a story like Eleanor's pops up. A 67-year-old woman, soaking wet but standing tall, staring down a sheriff who thought he was untouchable? That's not just a plot twist. It's a life lesson wrapped in a mic drop moment. And let's be real, Carver's water cop nickname? It's the kind of viral burn that'd trend faster than a celebrity wardrobe malfunction. So what's the takeaway here? Eleanor's silence wasn't just defiance. It was a masterclass in resilience. In a world where we're bombarded with noisy tweets, notifications, that coworker who won't stop humming, sometimes the loudest statement is staying calm, holding your ground, and letting the truth do the talking. Think about it. When was the last time you faced a bully online or IRL and chose dignity over a shouting match? Eleanor's story reminds us that power doesn't come from a badge or a megaphone. It comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone rewrite your narrative. And yeah, Carver learned that the hard way. His career's now a cautionary tale, probably taught in How Not to Be a Jerk 101. Here's the kicker. This isn't just a story from some small town in 2025. It's happening everywhere, maybe not with water bottles, but in the microaggressions, the sidelong glances, the systems that try to keep certain voices down. Eleanor's stand connects to the coworker who speaks up about unfair pay, the kid who calls out a toxic teacher, or even you scrolling right now wondering if one person can make a difference. Spoiler alert, they can. Just ask the mural artists, the students at Eleanor Thompson Academy, or the millions who shared Stand Like Eleanor. So let's get interactive. Your turn. What's a moment in your life where you stood your ground, even when it was tough? Maybe you didn't have a DOJ agent's son or a viral video, but did you ever stare down a Carver in your own way? Drop it in the comments on X, or better yet, tag us with Stand Like Eleanor. We're all ears, or rather all algorithms. Oh, and before you get back to your cat video marathon, don't forget to smash that subscribe button on our channel. We've got more stories like Eleanor's tales of grit, justice, and the occasional sheriff getting dunked on by karma coming your way. Stay tuned, stay woke, and keep standing tall.